Coming up on this week's RegCast.
This whole notion of the risk of the system from IT itself, in other words, IT as a risk, is becoming more and more prescient in the minds of the boards and the regulators, and frankly, the conversations with all the suppliers as well.
The EU has taken a very different approach to the UK. The EU's approach not only is prescriptive, but also focuses on ICT risk versus the UK's approach, which is significantly more principles based.
It's about the not just the IT organization, but how IT and risk and compliance and procurement are all going to work together as a broader, more holistic management team. And then ultimately, it's about how all those IT controls have a second and third line of defense.
This changes everything. Under the new rules, the first line of defense is going to be procurement. The last line of defense is those who are having to deal with these contractual arrangements on a day-to-day basis. The level of granularity to which one will need to go is infinitely greater than has been required before.
I'm PJ Di Giammarino, CEO and founder of JDBG, and I'm here today to kick off season 5 of RegCast, where we tackle operational resilience and how you win the marathon that's ahead of us. Just as a tiny bit of background, we've been a bit quiet on RegCast since our conference, and one of the reasons for that is that we've really been stuck in to operational resilience and all of the interdependent regulations that we talked about at our conference, like AI and cyber and all of the upcoming quantum rules. And we really have been rethinking this and saying there's some really fundamental issues out there, which we've seen in the press. We've seen CrowdStrike, we've seen the CHAPS failure, we've seen the Dutch airport, we've seen the Seattle airport. But no doubt, by the time you listen to this, there'll be 3 or 4 other big things in the news. So this whole notion of the risk of the system from IT itself, in other words, IT as a risk, is becoming more and more prescient in the minds of the boards and the regulators, and frankly, the conversations with all the suppliers as well. But that said, we have some very fast-moving deadlines. So we want to help our listeners stay up to date with what the latest thinking on what do these regulations say, but also what do they mean more broadly, so that they can navigate some of these very complex issues that frankly have been in the making for decades. These are not particularly new issues. But first, let me welcome Sam to the stage. Sam, welcome back to RegCast. I mean, you were part of that fantastic panel that we had at our conference, but what have you been up to in the last 6 months?
Well, mainly, I've been working through the issues that you've just run through, the operational resilience, which leads into or from conduct and culture within firms, DORA, the developments in artificial intelligence and the rules that are coming down the pipe there. There have been a lot of initiatives that you and I have seen relating to them. And hopefully, now that we are reaching the deadlines from particularly the EU and the UK, and to a very slightly lesser extent Australia, a little bit more actual practical movement in dealing with the issues that we're going to face there.
Yeah, you really got to love these deadlines. They make people stand up and take notice. A lot of this documentation has been out there for some time, correct? I mean, this isn't really a new concept?
No, it isn't. In fact, for very random reasons, I was scrolling back through emails and I found one that I sent to my contact list either just before lockdown, the original lockdown in the UK, or just after lockdown in the UK, where I was talking about the FCA rules on operational resilience. And I said something along the lines of, don't be fooled by the implementation date, which is still a very long way away. They are already in force. And this was on the basis of compliance and trade surveillance and monitoring, which the FCA regarded as having to be business as usual.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding that everybody was working from home and we were in a new paradigm.
And I think that's something that maybe has been lost on people, which is that the tolerance from regulators for these kind of failures has been going down, over years. I mean, this isn't something new. So the thought that all of a sudden some trade associations can get together and say we want to delay is not going to mean a whole heck of a lot from the regulator's perspective, is it?
It's a good question. We've seen very large directives and regulations being postponed or delayed at the last minute. Thinking particularly of MiFID II and MiFIR, where the rug was pulled at the 11th hour. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility, but there are two things. The sensible money is on it not being delayed, and the second thing is the chances of it being delayed diminish by the week, given CrowdStrike, the Amsterdam snafu, the Seattle attack, and all sorts of other things that are popping up every day.
Yeah.
It may be a soft landing rather than a cliff edge when it comes down to it, but that would be a regulatory, supervisory decision rather than we're just going to delay the rules in toto.
Yeah. And regardless, some of these programs start to get a momentum of their own, and there are firms that have been at this for years. I mean, they've been estimates of up over 100 million that they've been spent, by one large firm at least, realizing what this all means. And let's talk about just the especially in the Optica DORA, because it's a lot of text. I mean, it's 22,000 paragraphs, which we've been busy slicing and dicing and digging through. But a lot of the discussion, the language around DORA, if you just Google something about it, we'll talk about these pillars. And what I mean, I understand pillars in the sense of, risk pillars from a prudential risk management point of view. It doesn't necessarily translate all that well for something in a non-financial risk space for me. What is DORA really all about to you, Sam?
Well, the pillars, while we think about it in a regulatory capital context, actually could be quite helpful if one looks at the concept of pillars through the lens of what they do is break down the rules into sets or subjects. So one pillar being testing, another being incident management, another being governance, and then looking at another being looking at your third-party risk, and the last one being reporting. So although there are many hundreds of thousands of words and many thousands of paragraphs here, and lots of level 1 text and level 2 text in the classic EU fashion, you're looking at them in buckets as to what each bit actually means and how they relate to one another. What is more complicated, I think, is how they relate to other rules and regulations that are coming into force or in force already.
Yeah, and there's that perpetual conversation about principles versus rules, and in my mind, I really like the prescriptiveness Europe has gone to, because at least it gives you a starting point for arguing with your supervisor who tells you you're doing something wrong.
That is true. That is true. The EU has taken a very different approach to the UK, and I'm sure we're not saying anything that people don't already know, but it does bear saying constantly that the EU's approach not only is prescriptive, but also focuses on ICT risk, versus the UK's approach, which is significantly more principles based. Although the FCA handbook and the PRA rules will themselves changed to reflect the principles, and the EU-UK approach is wider in how do I continue to run my business, not just an ICT risk.
Yeah. But when people think ICT risk, they think cyber. And a lot of what I've heard in talking to some of the people that are in that space, the cyber risk and control folks, they're very, very good and disciplined in terms of how they've been thinking about managing these huge risks for a long time. Is that there's a lot of nuance when you back up more to a business strategy level, and there therefore are some new capabilities that I think aren't generally understood. When I look at it, I look at, well, who has to do something differently. And over the decades, that's the only thing that's really mattered to me for doing RegTech right, is who at the end of the day has a new obligation, and it's the manco that has actually put on paper their strategy in terms of what are their risks and how are they managing them, and as part of that, what their vendor approach is, and it's about the not just the IT organization, but how IT and risk and compliance and procurement are all going to work together as a broader, more holistic management team. And then ultimately, it's about how all those IT controls have a second and third line of defense, and they're with their vendors, and they have to create lots more transparency out to the regulator. And as ever, when you ask for transparency and shine lights on things, scary things pop out. So these are some big fundamental shifts. Do you see it that way as well?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the three lines of defense, because I saw the new rules, whether it's the UK or the EU rules, as a rewriting of the lines of defense. So if you take market surveillance, for example, the first line of defense is your front office, who are on the lookout for suspicious transactions and orders, who are then backed up on the compliance side by compliance, who are then backstopped by internal or external audit. This changes everything, because under the new rules, the first line of defense is going to be procurement. And then the backstop is the front office. Procurement is going to be the team which takes responsibility for ensuring that third-party risk of vendors is managed to the nth degree, or at least understood to the nth degree. That contracts that you enter into cover the contractual obligations that the rules impose on the firm. And then right at the last, the last line of defense is those who are having to deal with these contractual arrangements on a day-to-day basis. The ones who say, actually, the contract might say this, but the way it's working in practice is quite different, or it does, the way that the contract says this relationship should work actually is not how this works in practice. On a broader context.
Just on that point, Sam, if you could take a second to explain what you think this means from a vendor point of view, because these vendors are global. I mean, then this is a European rule with some very prescriptive things that are quite different. I mean, this whole notion of even dealing with the procurement department that's empowered is probably different for them. What does that mean?
Well, from those vendors which are global, call them superscalers, the enormous ones, they are, first of all, very likely to be caught by the rules in the UK and the EU, and will have semi-direct regulatory oversight when these rules come into force. So perhaps naively, to a larger extent, I'm not as concerned about the superscalers. It's the mid and small size vendors who will need to be acutely aware of the new obligations of their potential clients, because they are the ones for whom proportionality becomes very important. I'm a startup. You and I are sitting in a WeWorks office. We have a fantastic idea, but which we are looking to sell to large investment banks, large principal trading firms, asset managers, whatever, sell side. But it's just the two of us. So if something goes wrong, you and I may be asleep, or you're on holiday and I'm busy doing something else. I'm developing the product. Those are the firms that are most at risk here, because unless they are able to develop systems and controls to enable their potential clients to comply with their clients' obligations, no one's going to be able to use them. I don't remember the exact example, but I think you were telling me yesterday that you had spoken to a regulator, and you asked him a specific question about what happens if a regulator turns around and says that particular vendor is not very good. What is a client of that service and product supposed to do? And the response was, well, you have to go and find another vendor, go and find another provider. That's not as easy as it sounds. And I'm teaching my granny to suck eggs here, but no. What happens if, because of a lack of communication or a lack of engagement, and we've seen it with a slightly different example, but we've seen it with Telegram in the last few days. We may see it with other social media platforms, where regulators say, right, you're not complying with the rules, well, stuff you then. It's perfectly possible that at some point a regulator could turn around to its firms and say, you are not to use this superscaler.
Yeah.
Because
at which point you go right back to that senior business strategy conversation. You're meant to be looking in your vendor risk management strategy, and what's your fallback? Right. So even just in thinking through some of these plans, you're going to have to look at very disruptive scenarios, right?
These are existential threats to the ability to continue to operate your business as usual.
Yeah, talk a bit about like how the regime defines what is critical. What is a critical business function, and give some examples of some of the things you have to actually be thinking through here.
Well, I hesitate to use the example of a major investment bank, because I'll never be able to pick up all of their business lines. But an investment bank is a great example, because it will have an FX sales desk, it will have global derivatives desks, it will have equities, it will have retail engagement. All of these business lines are important to the bank. All will have pretty well siloed teams as you work your way down. There will be enterprise level systems at some level, and an enterprise level of governance. But that, again, that's going to be international. So if you're a bank headquartered in Tokyo, but you have a branch in Madrid, you have a subsidiary in the UK, you have another subsidiary in the Nordics, you have to consider all of the all of the inputs to those businesses and all of the rules that apply to them. I mean, it's an exercise through which we've all been with MiFID and the US rules and the rules that came to force with ASIC and globally. So it's not something that that's brand new, but it would require every single firm to draw a very detailed systems and vendor organogram.
And that vendor bit is one of the new key things, right? So even under MiFID, we talked about outsourcing back in 2007, but we never got serious about what were the real risks involved in that outsourcing and what was a regulated outsourced service versus something else that somebody else was offering us, right? So talk a bit about how that interplay will drive you into infinite detail on literally, thousands of contracts.
Well, that's precisely that is what's important here is the level of granularity to which one will need to go is infinitely greater than has been required before, and one is then going to have to look at one's vendors and this organogram that I mentioned earlier, and decide what happens if any of the lines in the organogram disappear. If this system, which talks to this system, which manages this product, falls over, what's my fail-safe? Where's the redundancy? It may well be that there is existing redundancy, in which case you can decide that particular relationship is not crucial, is not, in quotes, important, because you're running it in parallel with something that could step in, and vice versa.
Yeah, but at a minimum, the whole concept of drawing this organogram is fairly new, it's not easy. You've got to have a lot of data about what it is and how you operate. It's getting to the guts of the how, right? And there's 118 fields that you have to report out to your regulator about all of the contracts for these lines and boxes, right?
Agreed. And it's not actually even as simple as one system or one product feeding into another, because you will have legacy systems. You're going to have a foundation which has many things built on top of it. So if any one of those things goes wrong or goes pop, how does it affect everything else? So it is actually, no, it is a seriously complicated piece of work just to get to determine where the deltas are, where you might not be compliant, and it will involve all levels of management and people who are not used to sitting under the management or regulatory spotlight, people who manage IT contracts, various parts of legal and compliance functions who sit and are tasked with churning ISDA master agreements, for example, or credit support agreements.
Yeah.
There will be a technological element to those agreements, because how do you calculate an exposure or a liability or a benefit to or from somebody else without the technology and the data and the wherewithal to do so? And what happens if you can't do it at the time that you're meant to do it? What's the
and talk about that timing, because that's really critical as well, right? So take CrowdStrike. I don't know how many people had heard of CrowdStrike before we all got shut down by it, but that was an example of a third-party vendor to one of your critical suppliers that had access to the core. I'm still trying to find out how many other people have access to the core. I haven't been able to get there, but in that event, how would that incident be classified, and what would you have to do? How many hours would it take, and what do you have to tell the regulator?
Let's go back to before it happened, assuming DORA is in force. What a firm should be able to do even when CrowdStrike or a similar event happened, is first of all understand who its vendors are, then determine what would happen to its systems should its vendor go down, and then determine what tolerance the business has for that failure. So the classic example from a few years ago, when all of the ATMs for that particular UK bank stopped working. Now, as far as the business and the regulator were concerned, a single ATM being unavailable is okay, fine, whatever, because there are lots of other ATMs. But if every single ATM for your bank goes down, and if I put my card in another bank's ATM and that ATM can't communicate with my bank, that is a problem from the single moment that it happens. There will be other failures or system unavailability, which is for which a business will have more of a tolerance. I don't say this glibly, given that I'm in a service industry, but if one is unable to pay one's vendors' invoices on a 30-day, 60-day, whatever it is, deadline, and it's you're 2 days late paying your vendor, is that critical? Probably not. It would be very critical if you weren't able to pay your payroll on time. But
or your customers couldn't actually access their funds. So to your earlier,
exactly.
Yeah. So there's a whole level of judgment that needs to be taken over what is critical, is the point, and that judgment will feed into, if something bad happens, who do you have to tell about it, and how quickly does that happen, right? So you have to tell the regulator within 4 hours if it's major. You then have to think about telling customers. You then might have your other actors in the supply chain, like your CCPs or your payments or your trading venues, that have to get involved. And it all becomes a very, labor-intensive, time-intensive challenge of managing these outages that I don't think we've ever seen before.
Yeah, it's ironic that it becomes a labor-intensive thing, because given the size and scale of the financial services industry, if all you were doing was relying on labor management, you wouldn't be able to do it. So the management system has to be itself automated. The reporting element has to be automated to a large extent. The reporting element, internally, the external reporting element to one's customers and to one's regulators has to be automated to a very large extent as well.
That's a
so
great
we're it's the Terry Pratchett building. Incident reporting and automation all the way down.
Yeah, which I think is a great pivot into where are we now, and how do you do it right? So that we've timed out on getting all the metadata and identifiers and contracts and all those things in place, right? This is going to go in, within the next 100 days or 6 months or 3 quarters, depending on where you are. We're never going to fix the last 40 years of legacy sins of the past and the way we, didn't set up the identifiers for the kind of services that we're buying from a vendor and compare them across other services. So we're going to be in a bit of a muddle for quite a bit. Like what do you really need from an interpretation point of view about what does good enough look like, and what's the role of a lawyer in that?
Glad you said the role of a lawyer, because I was going to say what you really need is a good lawyer. What you really need, apart from a very good lawyer, is someone who is able to speak the language of the business, to interrogate those within management of the business to determine who are the best people to put together a plan, and to decide what the next steps are going to be, and get as much information as fast as possible to help you make those determinations. The role of the role of a lawyer is no longer one of being able to interpret and tell a client what the rules say, because one has to what's the word? You have to look at the rules through the lens or in the context of how they will be applying in practice to that particular business. No individual business is the same as any other.
But you have to be thinking like the regulator, right? You have to be thinking about all the previous precedents and the way all the rules are written to be able to define, well, what could the regulator think good looks like for you in that case where you have this kind of an issue?
Well, I don't disagree with that at all, but I think it might not be the regulator whose in whose shoes you have to put yourself. You have to put yourself maybe in the shoes of one of your most important customers. What would your most important customer regard as good enough?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on that's the real so what here, right? Because at the end of the day, the regulator is going to follow the heat in the market for anything systemic. So this gets back to then like, okay, where are the bodies buried today that will really affect those kind of customer level issues that the regulator will find so interesting and be all over you within a matter of hours of those kind of incidents manifesting themselves?
Where the bodies are buried will differ for every single firm. And coming back to my point about legacy systems and how you get lots of things plugging into the same base system, lots of things talking to other systems. Maybe we say that the biggest body is buried at the systems which are at an enterprise level. If you've got one small discrete business which you set up 2 years ago, you're going to have new software, new platform, new ways of doing business, which will likely be fairly discrete. But the businesses that you've been running for a very long time will have some of them will have COBOL on the bottom, or somewhere buried in there. The people who can code COBOL or can debug it are rapidly retiring to beaches. It's the long running big businesses which unironically are very important to your business, which is where the likely biggest bodies are buried.
Yeah. And those are the things that will get found out when we start having to do real supply chain testing or real, start getting the forensic detail on those incidents that do happen, or the really unhappy customers like the airline that's suing for $500 million now off the back of CrowdStrike.
Yes.
I think all that's where all this pressure goes. But what does that mean to the board?
Well, a public board is going to find that its share price is likely to take a massive hit. If something goes wrong and a very large customer sues it for a very large amount of money, and there is a series of really poor public relations disasters. In the UK, now we've had the senior manager and certification regime in force for a number of years, and although as time has gone on, the FCA have said that there are more and more things which matters that the FCA regards as board responsibility, and therefore, strictly speaking, I say you could say that the SMCR does not apply, and I am personally not going to be on the hook for something that goes wrong on my watch. You start looking at it as a conduct and culture thing. If I'm an investment bank with UK regulatory responsibilities, and I, as a board member, don't understand the plumbing, and I don't understand what happens if something goes wrong within the business for which I am responsible, whether that's AI or a cyber attack or an ICT piece of kit, it is likely that the FCA is going to knock on the door and say that my firm is not good enough as far as the culture of compliance is concerned. Yeah. The FCA has a long and distinguished history of attacking failure by saying it's a systems of controls problem.
Yeah. But actually, DORA and the conduct and culture regime you just mentioned gives European regulators a lot more teeth as well, right? Because this is criminal penalties, it's public censure, it's fines and even jail time, right? Yep. So I mean, these are real potential consequences that will be applied member state by member state with this overarching. Well, we should be managing these risks, and it's all written down for you.
Agreed. Which I know it's slightly at a tangent, but that does lead to a rather interesting discussion about reg arbitrage. It's like if Spain develops a jurisprudence of actually jailing board members, and France is on the side of censure, then where are you going to set up your HQ?
Or at least your IT department. Well, I think that you're right. That's a fascinating topic for later. Let's just close on to close this one out, because we're about time now. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think that this is really just the beginning, as you've highlighted. Let's just wrap up. What does it really mean to be doing this right, and what is it that's really changed from the way that you used to be able to operate your IT infrastructure?
What a firm regarded as good enough is changing, because it's to a very large extent now out of their hands. Nobody wants any part of their business to fail or to not be available, because time is money. You lose reputation, you lose cash, you lose revenue generation. Even a moment when that's not available is a bad thing. But now it's to a very large extent taken out of your hands, and your customers and regulators will be expecting more.
Well, I think that's a great ending point for this one. Thanks very much, Sam. I know we're not anywhere near going into the depths of all this, and we'll come back at some of this later. I look forward to having you and some of your colleagues on. I think that there's a series we're going to try to pick up on a few of the interesting angles that have come from this and some of the other research. So we'll be back out here again soon. Thank you for listening. Thank you for rating our podcast on whatever platform that you found it on. It really helps others come to grips with RegTech and what it all really means, and follow along. So until next time, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. And if you've enjoyed the content, please like us so more people can join the conversation. Download all our episodes via all the major platforms. Come to the JWG website, which is jwg-it.eu, and follow our LinkedIn groups.